There are nights when the stars feel older than memory, when the silence between them seems to hum with a lullaby you almost remember, but can never quite place. That is where his story begins, with a boy named Rick, though he was not yet the Rick you might imagine. Not a wanderer of infinite paths, not a cynic with a bottle in his hand, only a child, alone in the quiet of his own room, lying awake long past the hour when the world had gone still. His window was small, set crooked in the wall, and through it the stars looked stretched and blurred, as if the glass itself was uncertain how to hold them. Rick would press his cheek against the cool pane and whisper to those distant lights. He did not know why he whispered, only that the stars seemed to whisper back. Their language was not words but feelings, soft impressions, like the memory of warmth long after a fire had gone out. He had quirks, this boy. He counted the ticks of clocks until he fell into a rhythm that felt like floating. He drew patterns no one else could see, lines that curved and twisted like rivers across the page. At dinner, while others chewed without thought, he seemed to taste the future of every bite before it reached his tongue. Sometimes he laughed quietly, though no one had spoken. His family noticed and shook their heads, but in gentle resignation. He was simply strange, they said, and left him to his strangeness. What no one else knew was that Rick had begun to see something unusual. Choices. Not the choices themselves, but the afterglow of them, like echoes lingering in the air. He would see his mother pause before pouring water, and somehow know which glass she would choose. He would hear the shuffle of a neighbor's shoes and already sense which path they would take down the street. It was not dramatic, nor powerful, only quiet, almost tender, a knowledge too soft to share. There was a woman in his life who seemed to understand, though she never said so directly. His mother, weary but kind, would hum him to sleep. A lullaby, strange and unfinished, notes that rose and drifted like smoke from an unseen fire. Sometimes he thought the song carried secrets, fragments of stories she herself could not recall. Sometimes he thought she sang it for herself as much as for him. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart. One night he asked her what the song meant. She smiled in that faraway way she often did, brushed a hand through his hair, and told him it was older than her, older than memory, perhaps older than the stars. He didn't press her further. He simply closed his eyes and let the tune sink into him. It would remain with him always, that melody, a thread winding through his life, returning when he least expected it. The boy, so young then, did not know he was beginning a journey. He did not know that one day he would watch infinities collapse in silence and smile as though it were the most natural thing. For now, he was only Rick, lying beneath his tilted window, whispering to the stars, waiting for the clocks to guide him into sleep. And perhaps you, listening now, can feel what he felt. The soft ache of being different. The gentle comfort of a song that doesn't quite belong to this world. The hush of a universe that listens when you whisper, "Sleep, little listener. The story is only just beginning." Morning came slowly in the house where Rick grew. The walls held a kind of faded quiet, as though they had grown tired of echoing voices. Sunlight didn't pour in sharply, but drifted, like dust, dancing in the corners of the rooms. Rick often woke before the others. He would sit at the edge of his bed, listening. Not just to the creaks of the house or the birds outside, but to the hush of possibilities, all the tiny decisions the day might hold. He had a small ritual. Each morning, before speaking to anyone, he would pick up a simple pencil and draw a line. Sometimes it curved, Sometimes it broke into smaller strokes. Sometimes it stopped suddenly, unfinished. He never showed these lines to anyone. They didn't make pictures in the usual sense, but to Rick they felt like maps. Maps not of places, but of moods, of futures, of feelings still hidden. He would fold the pages carefully and place them under his mattress, a secret language written only for himself. When the others stirred, his mother humming already before her feet touched the floor, his father, quieter, always caught somewhere between presence and distance. Rick slipped into the rhythm of the household. There was breakfast, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence. But Rick noticed what no one else seemed to: the way his mother's hand lingered a moment on her teacup before lifting it, as if she was deciding whether to sip or not. The way his father's gaze seemed to settle on the window, as though the day might choose itself for him. These tiny moments of hesitation fascinated Rick. He began to collect them in his mind, noticing when people paused before speaking, noticing when they turned left instead of right. He could never explain why he cared so much, only that each small choice felt like a pebble falling into a still pond. Ripples moved outward, soft but certain. Rick could feel them. He was beginning to understand the secret that life is not shaped by the loud, grand events, but by the smallest hesitations, the quietest decisions, the moments no one remembers afterward. There was one person outside his family who seemed to notice him in return. An old neighbor named Maren. She lived 2 houses down, in a place where the garden had grown wild, vines climbing into windows as though trying to pull her back into the earth. She was kind, but not in the usual way. She never asked Rick what he wanted to be when he grew up, never scolded him for being strange. Instead, when she saw him staring too long at the sky, she would simply nod, as if to say, "Yes, I see it too." One afternoon, she invited him to sit with her beneath her overgrown tree. They didn't speak much. She gave him a slice of bread with honey, and they ate in silence. At some point, she said, "The world doesn't always speak in words. If you listen carefully, you'll hear its sighs, its laughter, its dreams. Most people grow deaf to those things, but not you." Then she went quiet again, rocking slowly in her chair. Rick felt no need to answer. He only tucked her words away inside himself, like another folded page under his mattress. That night, he lay in bed, turning over what she had said. Could the world truly laugh? Could it sigh? As he closed his eyes, he thought he heard it, a long exhale through the branches outside his window, almost like someone humming back to him. He smiled, and though he didn't fully understand, he felt less alone. The days continued this way: small drawings at dawn, quiet meals, secret observations of the world's pauses. He grew, but gently, as if life were unfolding around him rather than rushing forward. Each moment a soft stone placed in the path, each whisper of possibility another note in his mother's unfinished lullaby. Rick was still a boy, still learning to shape the silence around him. But the seed had been planted, that quiet sense that he was watching something larger than himself, something infinite. And though he didn't yet know it, those early mornings, those hidden drawings, those afternoons with Maren were already preparing him for the day when silence itself would become his greatest companion. For now, though, he only listened, and listening was enough. There are certain moments in a childhood that never announce themselves as important until long after they've passed. For Rick, one of those moments came on an evening when the house had grown too still, and he found himself wandering outside, barefoot, into the fading glow of twilight. The air smelled of damp grass and faraway rain. The street was empty, washed in the soft blue of evening. He sat down on the curb, pulling his knees to his chest, and stared at the horizon where the sun had slipped away. The sky, for a breathless span of minutes, seemed to hold every color at once, pinks, blues, greys, and that deepening black that only comes when the first stars prepare to appear. As he watched, Rick noticed something strange, not with his eyes, but with that other part of himself, the quiet sense that had been growing inside him. It was as if he could feel the weight of choices the day had made. The neighbor across the street deciding to close her shutters a little earlier than usual, a dog 3 houses down choosing not to bark. The tiniest ripples of decisions flowing out across the evening, settling like feathers in the dusk. He felt calm, more than calm. He felt as though he were part of something vast and steady. Not in control of it, but gently carried within it. A passenger inside a great invisible tide. Behind him, the Dowder creaked, and his mother's voice called softly, "Rick? You'll catch a chill out there?" But she didn't sound worried, only tender, as if she too sensed that something important was happening, something fragile that should not be interrupted. He turned his head and saw her leaning on the doorframe, watching him with that same faraway smile she often wore when she hummed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt like an understanding. Later that night, Rick returned to his room, and as was his ritual, he drew a line. But this one was different. Instead of curves or broken marks, he drew a long, steady path across the paper, unbroken, unhurried. When he looked at it, he didn't see a picture. He saw a feeling, the memory of sitting on the curb, of the colors bleeding across the sky, of being carried by something greater than himself. He folded the page and tucked it beneath his mattress. The following days seemed to glow with a subtle newness. He walked slower, listening more intently. He paused before speaking, sensing the words before they formed. Even when others laughed at his silences or mistook his quiet for shyness, Rick did not mind. He was beginning to understand that silence had its own kind of language, one most people had simply forgotten how to hear. He visited Maren again, the old neighbor whose garden was still a wild tangle of vines and blossoms. This time, she gave him a cup of tea instead of bread. They sat together on her porch steps, steam curling between them. After a while she said, "There's a rhythm underneath everything. The world sways to it. Most people walk too fast to notice." She glanced at him and her smile was small but knowing. "You'll notice." Rick didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply sipped his tea, watching the sky darken above her garden, feeling the rhythm she spoke of humming softly beneath the evening. That night, his mother hummed her lullaby again as he drifted towards sleep. The notes were as incomplete as ever, yet Rick sensed something new in them, something he could not name. It was as though the tune itself was another kind of map, one that would lead him not to places, but to understandings. He thought just before sleep pulled him under that perhaps the stars were listening too, that perhaps every choice, every sigh, every quiet hum was a note in a song older than memory. And with that thought he slept, his dreams filled with skies that never ended. Seasons have a way of reshaping a childhood, though at the time they arrive and pass as gently as breath. For Rick, the turning of seasons was not just a change of weather, but a shift in the language of silence itself. Spring brought the dripping of rain from gutters and the scent of damp soil. He would walk barefoot in the backyard, pressing his toes into the mud as though trying to memorize the earth beneath him. He noticed how even raindrops made choices. one sliding down a leaf's edge, another clinging stubbornly to its surface, and a third breaking away entirely, vanishing into the ground. Rick thought of them as little echoes of the larger decisions people made, each one rippling outward in its own way. Summer was warmth and wandering. He often lay in the grass for hours, arms stretched wide, letting the sun soak into him. Sometimes, with his eyes closed, he imagined the warmth was the hum of the universe itself, pulsing through him. His father would glance at him through the window and shake his head, muttering about laziness. But Rick didn't mind. In the quiet heat, he felt like he was listening to something hidden, a song beneath the daylight, too subtle for most to hear. Autumn crept in slowly, the days turning crisp and the evenings carrying the scent of smoke. Rick adored the way leaves seemed to surrender to gravity, fluttering down in spirals. He would watch them fall, each one tracing its own gentle path, never quite the same as another. To others, they were simply leaves. To Rick, they were messages. Proof that no two endings were ever alike and that every letting go carried its own quiet grace. And then winter arrived with its stillness and hush. Snow softened the world, muffling even the sounds of footsteps. Rick loved how the air felt sharper, how every breath turned into a fleeting cloud. He often sat by the window wrapped in a blanket, watching the flakes drift down. Sometimes he imagined each snowflake was a decision, falling into place, shaping the landscape in ways no one could predict. It was during one of these winters that something unusual happened. Late one night, when the rest of the house was asleep, Rick wandered outside. The world was blanketed in white, and the moon hung low, casting a silver glow across the street. He walked slowly, his footprints marking the untouched snow. And then, without knowing why, he stopped. The silence around him was absolute. Not empty, but full, as if the world were holding its breath. He felt the weight of infinite possibilities pressing against him, not frightening but strangely comforting. It was as though the snow, the stars, and even the moon itself were waiting for him to acknowledge them, to whisper back. And so he did. He whispered a single word, not a word of power, not even a word he would remember the next morning. Just a sound, soft and fleeting, carried into the air. The silence seemed to respond. Not with thunder or vision, but with a feeling, a quiet warmth, spreading through his chest, lingering even after he turned back toward the house. From that night on, he carried a sense that the world knew him, just as he knew it. Not in a grand or dramatic way, but in the gentle way a lullaby knows a child's breath. When he told Maren about it the next day, she only smiled and said, "That's how it begins, listening. And then, one day, you'll learn to answer." Rick didn't ask her what she meant. He only nodded as though he had already begun to understand. That evening, when his mother hummed her unfinished lullaby, he thought he recognized something of the snow's silence inside it. The same waiting, the same tenderness. He closed his eyes, letting the tune wrap around him like a blanket, and drifted into sleep with the sense that his story was beginning to widen, like a river fed by countless hidden streams. By the time Rick's childhood stretched into early adolescence, the world around him had grown more ordinary. Or at least, that's how others seemed to see it. School, routines, neighbors, the rhythm of days repeating. But for Rick, the ordinary was never quite so simple. He could still hear the sighs of the world beneath the noise, the small hesitations, the pauses that gave everything its shape. School was a place of chatter and noise, and Rick often drifted to the edges of it. Teachers scolded him for daydreaming, classmates teased him for staring out windows. Yet he was never fully alone. There was always the quiet company of his thoughts, the gentle hum of the universe that others seemed to miss. He found solace in that, the sense that even in the loudest rooms, silence could still find him. One day, while sitting under a tree during lunch, he began to sketch again. Not pictures, not stories, just lines, long arcs, sudden turns, broken edges that looked meaningless to anyone else. A classmate noticed and asked, "What are you drawing?" Rick didn't know how to answer. How do you explain that you're mapping the mood of the wind, that you're tracing the path of a choice no one has made yet? So, he shrugged, closed the notebook, and let it remain his secret. When he returned home, Maren was waiting outside her garden. She waved him over and asked if he had been listening lately. Rick nodded. She smiled. Good. Listening is the beginning of wisdom. Most people talk because they fear silence, but silence speaks too if you're patient enough. She didn't explain further. She never did. But her words lingered like echoes following Rick long after he left her porch. His mother, too, seemed to notice something in him, though she never named it aloud. Sometimes, when he came home late, she would glance at him in that quiet, faraway way and ask, "What did the world tell you today?" Rick didn't always answer. But once, he whispered, "That everything's alive, even when it looks still." She nodded, as if she understood perfectly, and began to hum her unfinished lullaby. That night, as the tune drifted through the house, Rick lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He thought of his drawings, the conversations with Maren, the silence of the snow, the way choices rippled out like leaves falling in autumn. He realized slowly that all of these pieces were connected. The world was always speaking, through people, through seasons, through songs and silences. His gift, if it could be called that, was simply that he had learned how to hear it. But hearing was not the same as knowing what to do. The whispers of the universe were vast and gentle, yet they did not tell him where to go, only that there was always more to notice. And Rick, though he did not yet understand the weight of what lay ahead, felt the first stirrings of something larger. It was not ambition nor destiny, only curiosity, a soft pull like the tug of the tide, a sense that the silence he loved so much was not empty, but infinite, and somewhere, hidden in its folds, it was waiting for him to answer back. For now, he remained a boy on the edge of growing up, carrying within him an unfinished song, a collection of secret maps, and a heart tuned to the hush of unseen things. The world was beginning to lean toward him, just as he leaned toward it. And in that gentle leaning, the journey quietly began. Growing older did not arrive for Rick all at once. It crept into his life like dusk, slipping slowly across the sky. One unnoticed shadow at a time. His legs grew longer, his voice carried a new edge, but inside he still felt like the same boy, pressing his ear to the silence of the world. School pressed harder on him now. Teachers expected answers, not pauses. Friends expected laughter, not quiet stares at the sky. Rick learned to nod, to respond when spoken to, but he kept his true listening hidden. He drew less during the day, and more at night, folding his strange maps of lines beneath his mattress where no one else could find them. Still, his peculiar gift did not fade. If anything, it sharpened. Choices glowed brighter before him. Sometimes when someone stood in front of him with two thoughts on their tongue, he already knew which one would be spoken. He never spoke of this to anyone. It wasn't power, not really. It was gentler than that. It was like standing in the shallows and feeling the current brushing past his ankles, always hinting at where the river might flow. Maren, his neighbor, remained a quiet companion in his life. She had grown frailer, her hair thinner, her steps slower, yet her presence was unchanged. She was still the one who reminded him that silence had its own rhythm. One evening, she handed him a book with pages worn soft from time. She said, "Not everything is written in words. Some books teach you to notice the spaces between them." Rick took the book home. He read it, but it was not the stories that mattered. It was the empty margins, the faded ink, the pauses between sentences. He found himself lingering there, in the spaces where nothing was said. It comforted him to think that even books, like people, carried silence inside them. At home, his mother's lullaby never truly left the air. Even when she hummed absent-mindedly, while folding laundry or washing dishes, Rick heard the same unfinished notes. Sometimes he tried to hum along, hoping to complete the melody. But the tune always resisted, always drifting just beyond completion, as though it belonged to something far larger than their little home. He stopped trying to finish it. Instead, he let it remain unfinished, like so much else in his life. One winter evening, after his father had gone to bed early, Rick sat at the kitchen table with his mother. They shared slices of bread with butter, simple and warm. She asked him what he was thinking. He told her the truth, that everything feels bigger than it looks. She tilted her head, considering his words, then placed her hand over his. "That's because you see more than most. Don't be afraid of that, Rick." Her eyes softened, though there was a shadow of worry in them too, as though she knew what such sight might cost. That night, Rick dreamed of infinities. Not wild adventures, not flashing lights, only countless doorways opening and closing in silence. He walked among them calmly, watching choices collapse and reform, worlds folding in on themselves as gently as snow falling to earth. When he woke, he felt a strange peace, as though he had glimpsed something he could not name, something that belonged to him, and yet not to him at all. He didn't tell anyone about the dream. He simply drew another line in his secret notebook, this one looping and spiraling without end. The boy was changing, quietly, and the world around him was beginning to change with him. He could feel it in the pauses, in the air between words, in the unfinished melody of his mother's song. And though he still walked softly, still whispered to the stars, he was no longer only a child staring out of windows. He was becoming someone else. Someone who listened not just to silence, but to the endlessness hidden within it. By now, Rick's days were marked less by the games of children and more by the slow contemplations of someone who seemed older than his years. He still walked to school, still carried books, still answered questions when pressed. But beneath it all, he was listening, always listening. The world, he had come to realize, did not speak with a single voice. It whispered in many ways, in the pauses of strangers, in the rustle of leaves, in the way sunlight chose one patch of earth over another. The older he grew, the more those whispers seemed to follow him. They were no longer faint impressions at the edges of his awareness. They were constant companions. Sometimes this made him feel comforted, as if he were never truly alone. Other times it weighed on him, the way 1,000 choices pressed against his chest, heavy yet unseen. He never told his classmates about this weight. How could he? To them he was simply quiet, strange, maybe even distant. But to Rick, the distance was filled with meaning. Maren continued to guide him in her subtle way. She was thinner now, her steps slower, her breath sometimes catching in the middle of a sentence. Yet she still met him on her porch, still offered him tea or bread, still spoke in riddles that seemed clear only years later. One afternoon, as the sun slipped. "Lo," she told him, "most people think the future is something that rushes toward them. They run, they chase, they stumble. But the truth is the future is already here. It waits in the corners, in the silence, in the breath you haven't yet taken. All you must do is notice." Rick turned her words over in his mind long after he walked home. That night, while brushing his teeth, he watched the water swirl down the drain. He wondered if the future was in that swirl, small, constant, waiting. And as he slipped into bed, he hummed the first few notes of his mother's lullaby, half to himself, half to the silence that filled his room. His mother, too, seemed more aware of his inwardness as he grew. She would watch him sometimes with a look of both pride and sorrow, as though she saw the man he might become, and mourned that his childhood would never be ordinary. One evening, she asked if he ever felt lonely. Rick thought for a long moment, then answered, "Not lonely, just quiet." She reached across the table, squeezed his hand and whispered, "Quiet can be a gift, don't forget that." Rick didn't forget. He carried her words with him the way he carried Marin's. He began to see how every person who truly noticed him left behind, not instructions, but fragments that built a path forward, soft and unspoken. And yet, for all the quiet wisdom growing inside him, Rick was still a boy on the edge of becoming something more. He laughed at small things. He found joy in the taste of fruit in summer, in the crackle of fire in winter. He was not lost in solemnity. The silence he loved was not cold. It was warm, like a blanket he could wrap around himself. One night, unable to sleep, he slipped outside and lay in the grass. The stars stretched above him, infinite, scattered across the darkness like sparks from an unseen fire. He whispered to them as he always had, though now his whispers carried a new weight. "I hear you," he said softly, as though to the stars themselves. "I don't know what you want me to do, but I hear you." The wind shifted then, rustling through the trees, carrying the faintest scent of rain. It was no answer, not in words, but Rick smiled. For him, it was enough. He went back inside, drew another looping line in his secret notebook, and slipped beneath his blanket. As he drifted towards sleep, he thought of Marin's words, of his mother's unfinished song, of the choices he felt humming all around him. And with those thoughts, he surrendered to dreams. Dreams not of battles or victories, but of endless doorways, waiting patiently in silence. The following months brought a subtle shift to Rick's world. The streets of the town remained the same, the leaning fences, the worn cobblestones, the same shopkeepers with their practiced smiles. Yet to Rick, they seemed different. Every corner carried a faint shimmer, as if the ordinary world were layered over something unseen, and only he had learned to notice the outlines beneath. He no longer hurried through his days. Where once he might have rushed to finish a task or avoided the meandering pauses of an elder's story, now he lingered. He lingered in the stillness between breaths. He lingered in the spaces where no words were spoken. To him, those silences were alive. At school, the other children still found him unusual. They would laugh together in noisy bursts, sharing secrets that flew past Rick like smoke. He didn't begrudge them. Their joy was their own, bright and unshaken. Rick's joy lived elsewhere, in smaller moments, the way a bird landed exactly where he expected it to, or the way the bell of the church rang with a note that seemed to echo a thought he hadn't yet spoken. One afternoon, he returned to Marin's porch to find her asleep in her chair. Her hands were folded in her lap, her face softened by age, her breath shallow but steady. Rick sat quietly beside her, unwilling to wake her, and for the first time he wondered what his life might look like without her guidance. The thought unsettled him. But then, as the wind stirred, he noticed the way her garden leaned toward the sunlight, as though it too carried her voice, her teaching. It reassured him. Even if her body left, the silence she taught him to listen to would remain. Later that evening, Maren awoke and turned to him with a smile. "You're learning," she said simply, though he had spoken no words. "You've begun to see the threads that hold things together." Rick asked what she meant, and she gestured vaguely to the horizon. "The world is stitched with choices, Rick. Most people see only the cloth. You see the thread." Those words sank deep into him. That night, as he sat at his desk, he opened his notebook again. Page after page was filled with lines, circles, and symbols that no one else could understand. He didn't try to explain them. They weren't for others. They were for him. A map of impressions, a way of recording the things he could never say aloud. Sometimes he wondered if, years from now, the notebook would make sense, if it would tell the story of a life shaped not by noise, but by silence. His mother continued to watch him with quiet concern. She worried, he could tell, though she rarely said it. One evening, as they shared supper, she asked if he ever wished to be more like the other children. Rick considered her question. After a long pause, he shook his head. "They have their way," he said softly. "I have mine." She looked at him with a mixture of sadness and pride, then reached across the table to touch his cheek. "Then walk your way, Rick, but don't walk it alone." Her words lingered with him long after the meal ended. He understood them differently than she perhaps intended. To Rick, not walking alone did not mean seeking constant company. It meant recognizing that in every silence, in every unspoken choice, there was presence. He was never truly alone, even when the room was empty. One night, when the moon was bright enough to cast silver shadows across his floor, Rick dreamed. In the dream, he stood at a vast crossroads. Countless paths stretched before him, some narrow and crooked, some wide and gleaming. At each fork, he felt the pull of possibilities, each humming with its own weight. He did not choose a path in the dream. He simply stood, listening. When he woke, the sensation remained, as if the dream had been more real than waking. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, humming the fragments of his mother's lullaby. The sound was quiet, steady, like a thread weaving its way through him. And as the lullaby faded into silence, Rick realized something new. He was not waiting for the future to arrive. He was already standing within it, moment by moment, listening for its shape. For the first time, this thought did not unsettle him. It comforted him. Whatever came, he would meet it not with haste or fear, but with the same calm patience that had carried him this far. And so, beneath the gentle glow of the moon, he closed his eyes and drifted into sleep, not running from tomorrow, but resting within it. The seasons shifted once more, and with them came a quiet turning in Rick's heart. The air grew cooler, the trees shed their leaves in muted spirals, and the town seemed to fold into itself, preparing for the long sleep of winter. Rick found comfort in these changes. Where others mourned the loss of warmth, he saw a lesson in the falling leaves, that nothing ended, only transformed. He often walked the long road that wound past the fields and toward the distant woods. The earth beneath his shoes carried the scent of rain and roots. Sometimes he paused and simply closed his eyes, listening. There was always something hidden in the silence. The faint rush of wind through bare branches, the distant call of a bird he could not see. These sounds, small and fleeting, wove themselves into him until he felt less like an observer and more like a thread in the fabric itself. At times, though, the silence pressed heavier upon him. One cold evening, as the fog rolled through the streets, he felt a loneliness unlike any he had known. The laughter of other children, drifting faintly from behind closed doors, carried with it a sharp reminder. He lived differently. He carried things they could not see. He wondered then if this path of listening, of dwelling in silence, might one day leave him standing apart from everyone he loved. That night, restless and unable to sleep, Rick crept to the porch where Maren often sat. Though the hour was late, she was there, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her eyes fixed on the stars. Without looking at him, she said, "You've begun to feel the weight of it, haven't you?" Rick sat beside her and nodded. He tried to find words, but they fell short. Maren's voice was quiet, steady. "The gift you carry is not an easy one. It will always make you different. But listen to me, Rick. Being different is not the same as being alone. The silence you hear, the threads you follow, they connect you to everything, even when people cannot see it, even when they do not understand." Rick thought about her words long after she returned indoors. He gazed up at the night sky, each star flickering like a faraway lantern, and felt an odd peace settle into him. The loneliness did not vanish, but it softened. He could bear it if it meant walking this path with open eyes. Days passed into weeks, and winter's first snow arrived. The town seemed to hush under its blanket of white. Rick loved the sound of snow, or rather, the way it seemed to muffle every sound, wrapping the world in a deeper silence than even he had known before. Walking through it, he felt as though he were moving in a dream, each footstep pressing softly into the earth, leaving behind a mark that would soon disappear. One afternoon, he came upon a bird trapped in the snow. Its wing was bent awkwardly, its body trembling. He knelt beside it, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to rush home for help, but another part whispered to remain still. He cupped his hands gently around the creature, feeling the rapid beat of its heart against his palms. For a long while, he simply sat there, breathing slowly, until the bird calmed. When he loosened his grip, it did not fly, but it no longer trembled. Rick built a small hollow in the snow, lined it with scraps of dried grass, and placed the bird inside. He returned every day to check on it. Slowly, the bird grew stronger. The day it finally spread its wings and lifted into the pale winter sky, Rick felt a quiet joy bloom inside him. Not triumph, not pride, just the simple recognition that he had shared in the stillness of another life. And that was enough. That evening, as he sat by his window, notebook open before him, he drew the bird, not as it looked, but as it felt. A series of lines that curved upward, carrying the suggestion of flight. Beneath it, he wrote a single word: patience. It struck him then that his notebook was not a record of events, but a mirror of what silence had taught him. Each page was a conversation, not with others, but with the unseen. With the threads Maren spoke of, with the quiet rhythm of life itself. As snow continued to fall, Rick closed his notebook, leaned back in his chair, and allowed the hush of winter to cradle him. He was learning not only to listen to the silence, but to trust it. It was no longer something outside of him. It was within him, a companion he would carry wherever he went. And in that thought, as sleep pulled at his eyelids, Rick felt certain of one truth. The world's mysteries were not meant to be solved. They were meant to be lived one quiet moment at a time. Winter loosened its grip slowly, and the town began to breathe again under early signs of spring. Rick noticed the subtle changes, first in the way the snow softened, then in the small green shoots daring to emerge from the frozen ground. Life, even after stillness, always found a way to seep through. He liked that. He liked the way resilience appeared quietly, without fanfare, yet undeniable in its persistence. His mornings had become ritualistic. He woke early, often before the sun reached the horizon. He would sit by his window, notebook open, tracing invisible threads between what he saw and what he felt. The wind on his face, the murmur of distant streams, the way shadows shifted across the pavement. Each moment seemed to hum with its own subtle narrative. Rick began to understand that the world was not linear. It did not march forward in predictable steps. Instead, it folded and unfolded, a series of choices, echoes, and whispers. School remained a place where he felt a part, though not lonely. The children still chased laughter and mischief, their voices ringing loud in the hallways. Rick moved quietly through it all, observing, listening. Sometimes he would catch a glance from a teacher, a fleeting moment of curiosity, perhaps even respect. He didn't know if they realized he was noticing the tiny hesitations, the quiet choices that shaped their actions. He didn't need them to. It was enough that he could see it. Marin's presence, though fading slowly with age, continued to guide him. One afternoon, she gestured toward her wild garden, tangled and overflowing with life. "Do you see, Rick," she said softly, "how even the most chaotic growth has balance? Nothing is wasted, nothing is unmeasured, even if it seems disorderly. Watch closely, and you'll see the order in chaos." Rick did watch. He traced the vines with his eyes, followed the path of a falling leaf, felt the weight of each choice the world made around him. He began to notice how his own small actions rippled outward, a kind word, a pause in conversation, the gentle holding of a door for someone. The world, he realized, responded not to grand gestures, but to subtle nudges, soft touches that shaped the unseen. One evening, as dusk draped itself over the town, Rick wandered beyond the familiar streets to the edge of the woods where shadows gathered. He walked slowly, listening. The air felt heavier here, filled with the quiet breath of the earth itself. He paused beside a small stream, watching the water swirl over stones. It reminded him of the lines he drew in his notebook. Currents moving around obstacles, shaping paths with gentle insistence. Rick knelt and let his fingers skim the water. It was cold, sharper than he expected. But it was alive, and it responded to his touch in ways no one else could see. He stayed for a long while, tracing patterns in the ripples, whispering words he did not fully understand. "I hear you," he said. And in the hush that followed, he felt a shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Returning home, he found his mother, still, awake. She was folding laundry by the dim light of a lamp. "You seem changed," she said quietly, not accusing, just observing. Rick smiled faintly. "I think I'm learning to notice," he replied. She reached over, touched his shoulder, and hummed her unfinished lullaby. The tune carried softly through the room, more familiar than ever, yet richer now, threaded with the awareness he had begun to gather. That night, in bed, he opened his notebook. The pages were a tangle of lines, spirals, and loops, each one a memory, an observation, a whisper of what he had heard in the quiet of the world. He added another page, a long line that curved gently, carrying with it the impression of the stream he had touched, the hush of the evening, the subtle weight of being awake to life. As sleep came, he felt something shift within him, not dramatically, not with fireworks or storms, but with the quiet certainty of a stone settling in water. He realized that the act of noticing, of listening, of being present, was itself a kind of magic, a soft, invisible power enough to shape the world in ways unseen but profound. And as he drifted toward dreams, he felt a sense of belonging, not to the noisy world, not to the fleeting laughter of others, but to the deeper, invisible rhythm of life, the subtle current of choices, whispers, and silences that stretched beyond sight or measure. In that quiet surrender, Rick allowed himself to rest. Spring deepened into its fullest form, and the town seemed to pulse with life in ways Rick could feel in the quietest moments. Flowers unfurled along fences, the air carried the faint hum of insects, and sunlight threaded gold through the leaves. To anyone else it might have seemed ordinary. To Rick it was a symphony of quiet decisions, each bloom, each flutter of wings, a note in the endless song of existence. He walked through the streets more deliberately now, feeling the pull of small, unseen currents. Every gesture mattered. A nod to the shopkeeper, a careful step on a loose cobblestone, the gentle touch of a hand on a friend's shoulder. Rick had begun to understand that life's true magic was never in grand gestures or shouted proclamations. It was in these quiet acts, the ones that left no mark but carried meaning nonetheless. Maren, though frail, still shared her presence with him. One afternoon, she took his hand and led him to a patch of wildflowers she had allowed to grow unchecked. "Life is persistent," she said softly, "even when it seems fragile. Notice how it bends toward the light, how it reaches, even when no one watches. That's how we must be too." Rick traced the stems with his fingers, feeling the rough texture and the delicate bloom. He thought of the choices he made each day, small and subtle, and how they shaped not just his path, but the lives of those around him. Perhaps that was the purpose of listening, to see the threads that connected all things even when they were hidden from view. At school, Rick's quiet nature remained a contrast to the noise and clamour of others. Yet something had changed. Teachers began to glance at him differently, noticing the way he observed rather than reacted. Classmates occasionally sought him out, drawn not by his voice but by the calmness he carried. Rick did not fully understand it, but he accepted it. He had long learned that influence need not shout to be present. One evening, after a long walk near the river, Rick returned home to find his mother sitting on the porch. She handed him a small notebook, worn at the edges. "I kept this for you," she said. "It belonged to your grandmother. She always said that some things are best understood when you trace them with your own hands." Rick opened the notebook carefully. The pages were filled with sketches, lines, and half-formed thoughts, similar to his own. He could feel the weight of generations in the pages, the quiet persistence of noticing, the patient act of understanding life through observation. He realized that this inheritance was not of wealth or fame, but of attention, care, and the ability to see what others overlooked. That night, Rick lay in bed, the notebook open beside him. He traced the lines with his eyes, feeling the echo of those who had lived before him. It was comforting to think that in some way he was part of a long chain of quiet observers, each one adding their understanding to the tapestry of life. He thought then of Maren and his mother, of the snow and the streams, of the way choices rippled through the world like subtle currents. He felt a deepening sense of purpose, not dramatic or urgent, but steady, like the turning of the seasons. He understood that his journey was not about speed or achievement. It was about presence, about being awake to the quiet, invisible connections that shaped everything around him. As he drifted to sleep, Rick imagined the threads of the world stretching out from him, reaching toward friends, toward strangers, toward the smallest creatures in the fields and the sky. He whispered into the dark, "I see you," knowing that the act of seeing, of noticing, was itself an affirmation of life. And in that gentle awareness he found peace. Not finality, not conclusion, but the deep, abiding comfort of being part of something larger than himself. Summer arrived slowly that year, stretching its warmth over the town in soft, lingering waves. Rick noticed how the sunlight fell differently each day, on the rooftops, on the fences, across the winding streets, and he felt the subtle shift of time pressing lightly against the world. Everything moved, yet nothing hurried. There was a rhythm in it that he could follow, if only he paused to notice. He spent long afternoons in the meadows beyond the edge of town. The grass reached up to his knees, and the breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. Rick walked among the tall stems, feeling their brush against his hands, listening to the hum of life beneath the surface. Each insect, each rustle of leaves seemed deliberate, purposeful, even if their intent was invisible. Maren met him there sometimes, leaning on her cane, a quiet smile on her lips. She would watch him wander and say little, but Rick understood her presence as guidance. One day she said, "Everything moves because it must. But notice how some things linger, how some moments stretch longer than others. Those are the ones that matter." Rick pondered her words as he wandered. He realized that much of life's weight was carried in these quiet stretches, the breaths between actions, the stillness between moments of change. It was not dramatic, not urgent, but it shaped him more than the loud events of the world ever could. At home, his mother hummed her lullaby as she worked in the kitchen. The melody seemed richer in the summer heat, each note stretching lazily like the sun across the floorboards. Rick would sometimes hum along, letting his voice merge with hers, forming a duet that was not meant for anyone else to hear. He felt these moments linger longer than he had before, noticing the space they created around him, a small universe of calm within the busy world. School continued to pass in its usual rhythms, but Rick's perception of it had deepened. He noticed the way sunlight caught dust motes in the classroom, the hesitation in a classmate's answer, the subtle gestures that went unnoticed by others. He understood now that life was composed of these tiny currents, often invisible, yet shaping everything quietly. One evening, after a particularly warm day, Rick wandered to the river. The water shimmered with the reflections of the sky, ripples moving in gentle patterns across its surface. He sat on a smooth stone at the edge and let his fingers trail in the cool water, feeling the pull and push of currents he could not fully see. In the hush of the evening, he whispered, "I hear you," and felt again the faint echo of a response. Not in words, but in the sense of presence that always followed him when he truly listened. He returned home, notebook in hand, and began to draw again. Long flowing lines curved across the page, spirals that echoed the currents in the river, loops that mirrored the lazy drift of summer clouds. Each mark carried the sensation of what he had observed, a translation of the world into symbols that only he could read. That night, as he lay beneath the ceiling of his room, he realized that life's subtle lessons had become a part of him. Not through force or instruction, but through patient attention, through noticing, through being awake to what others overlooked. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from achievement but from understanding. The understanding that even small, unseen actions carried weight, and that noticing them was its own form of participation in the world. And as sleep claimed him, Rick imagined himself moving through the currents of the world, tracing paths in silence, listening to the whispers of the earth, the wind, the invisible threads that connected all things. He felt a soft joy, a calm certainty, and the knowledge that no matter how small, his presence mattered. The days grew longer, and summer began to wane, leaving traces of warmth along the edges of the town. Rick noticed how the light changed, how it softened into amber by late afternoon, brushing against rooftops and winding streets with a patient hand. It was a time that invited reflection, and Rick found himself walking slowly, letting the world settle into him as he moved. He spent hours beneath the trees at the edge of the fields, listening to the wind pass through the leaves, feeling the soft tremble of each branch as if the trees themselves breathed in rhythm with him. To others, these might have been idle hours, wasted moments. To Rick, they were lessons, not in textbooks or lectures, but in the quiet persistence of life itself. Maren visited him one afternoon, leaning on her cane, a faint smile on her lips. She motioned toward the horizon. "Do you see how the shadows stretch as the sun moves? Life, too, stretches us if we are willing to notice. Sometimes we are bent, sometimes elongated, but always alive." Rick nodded, understanding more in her silence than any words could convey. He began to feel the stretch of his own existence, the way each day pulled him forward, shaping him gently, imperceptibly. He was learning that growth was rarely sudden or dramatic. It was a series of small shifts, cumulative and quiet, like the slow bend of a tree toward the sun. At home, his mother hummed her lullaby while tending to the garden. The song had grown familiar, yet never lost its tenderness. Rick sometimes joined in, his voice barely audible, weaving his sound into hers. It comforted him that even in small harmonies there was a connection that transcended words. In these moments he understood that presence mattered more than perfection, and that listening was as vital as speaking. School continued its rhythm, though Rick was no longer merely a passive observer. He began to offer quiet help to those who faltered, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of attentiveness. A shared pencil, a reassuring glance, a soft word whispered at the right time. These were the currents through which he shaped the world. He realized that influence was not measured by notice, but by the subtle shifts it left behind. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned soft orange, Rick wandered along the riverbank. The water mirrored the colors of the sky, rippling gently over stones worn smooth with time. He let his fingers skim the surface, feeling the delicate movement of currents beneath. He whispered softly, "I see you," as he always did. And for a moment he felt an echo, a sense of presence acknowledging his quiet vigilance. Returning home, he opened his notebook, tracing lines that curved and looped in patterns he could only understand. Each stroke carried the impressions of the day, the subtle lessons hidden in ordinary events, the connections that flowed unseen from one being to another. The notebook had become more than pages and ink. It was a record of attention, of life lived with awareness. That night, lying beneath the ceiling of his room, Rick reflected on the passing summer. He realized that everything he had learned, patience, attentiveness, the quiet power of presence, was not a lesson taught by grand events, but by the slow, gentle unfolding of ordinary moments. And in this realization, he felt an unfamiliar lightness, a soft joy that did not demand recognition, only acceptance. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the world settle into him, a subtle reassurance that he was part of something larger. The trees, the wind, the water, Maren, his mother, the small acts of kindness he had given, all were threads in a vast, invisible tapestry, and he could feel himself woven securely within it. And as sleep drew him down into its calm, Rick understood, in the simplest way possible, that his journey was not about achieving or conquering, but about noticing, connecting, and quietly participating in the endless flow of life. Autumn crept softly into the town, brushing rooftops and streets with a golden hush. Rick noticed the change first in the light. It softened, turned amber, and lingered longer in the corners of the world. The air carried the faint scent of leaves, damp earth, and the whisper of things fading into quiet. He walked slowly, savoring the subtle rhythms of the season, letting it settle into him as he moved. He found himself drawn to the river more often now. The water had slowed in places, reflecting the soft decay of leaves drifting across its surface. Rick would sit on the bank, tracing circles in the air above the water, imagining how currents shaped the world quietly, invisibly. The ripples reminded him of choices, small gestures, quiet words, moments often overlooked, yet carrying the weight of existence. Maren joined him on one of these walks, her steps slow, her breath soft, but her eyes sharp. She gestured toward the fallen leaves. "See how each one moves differently in the wind," she said gently. "No two paths are alike. That is the way of life. And the same is true for you, Rick. You move differently. That is not wrong. It is just yours." Rick watched the leaves swirl, carried by currents he could neither see nor control, and he understood. The pattern of life was not in control, nor in force. It was in noticing, in moving alongside it, and in embracing the quiet unpredictability of the journey. He felt the weight of this awareness settle like a soft blanket over his shoulders. At home, his mother hummed her familiar lullaby while folding autumn linens. The melody, worn and gentle, seemed to stretch longer in the crisp evening air. Rick joined softly, letting his voice merge with hers, a duet of memory and presence. These moments, fleeting yet eternal, had become the foundation of his understanding, that love, attention, and care were best expressed quietly, persistently, without need for acknowledgement. School days carried their usual rhythm, but Rick's perception of the world had deepened. He noticed the hesitation in a classmate's hand, the weight of a friend's unspoken worry, the subtle sway of someone's emotions beneath a calm face. Each observation added threads to the tapestry he was quietly weaving, threads that connected him to life in ways no one else could see. One evening, under a sky streaked with amber and violet, Rick wandered the familiar path toward the woods. He paused as a gust of wind lifted a leaf and carried it along the stream. It spun slowly, turning over itself, then landed softly on the bank. Rick smiled, understanding that this simple dance held its own lesson, of patience, of yielding, of embracing movement without fear. Returning home, he opened his notebook, tracing long, flowing lines, loops, and spirals. Each stroke recorded the impressions of the day, the shifting light, the swirling leaves, the gentle echoes of Maren's wisdom. The pages had become a map, not of geography or events, but of attention, understanding, and the subtle interplay of moments. That night, as he lay beneath the ceiling of his room, Rick thought of the seasons, of the rivers, of Maren, his mother, and the unseen threads that connected him to everything. He understood that life's meaning was not found in grand gestures or loud declarations, but in the quiet presence that allowed the world to unfold around him. And as sleep drew him gently down, he felt a profound contentment, not the end of a journey, but the quiet awareness of walking it fully, tenderly and in tune with all that whispered and shimmered in the spaces between. The chill of late autumn settled across the town, softening edges and dulling sounds, as if the world were holding its breath. Rick felt it too, not as a shiver, but as a quiet slowing, a gentle reminder that time, like the seasons, moved in cycles that were often unseen but deeply felt. He walked through the streets with deliberate steps, noticing the way the sunlight glinted off a patch of frost, the way shadows lingered longer on the walls, the subtle whispers of the wind through bare branches. Maren's visits became more infrequent, her frailty evident in the slower movements and shorter breath. Yet, when she was there, her presence held the weight of the world's wisdom, distilled into quiet statements and patient gestures. One afternoon, as Rick sat with her in the garden, she said, "You've begun to carry it all, haven't you?" The silence, the noticing, the gentle weight of things unseen. Rick nodded. He had come to understand the meaning of her words. Life was not a race, nor a list of achievements. It was a collection of subtle moments, threads weaving a tapestry that could only be seen when one truly looked. And in that tapestry he was learning to find his place. Not at the center, not in dominance, but as a part of the delicate weave. At home, his mother hummed her familiar lullaby in the evenings. Rick would hum along softly, his voice blending with hers, their melodies forming a quiet bridge between generations, a living thread of care and attention. It was in these small harmonies that he felt the profound beauty of connection, a reminder that love often spoke not in loud proclamations, but in gentle presence. The town itself seemed to lean into winter, slowing in its own rhythm. Rick walked to the river one evening, the water dark and reflective under the fading sun. He let his fingers trail in its surface, feeling the slow current move beneath. The river had taught him patience, humility, and the quiet power of persistence. He whispered, "I hear you." And for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to hum back, not in sound but in sensation, a subtle acknowledgement of presence. He returned home to open his notebook once more. The pages had become more than drawings or notes. They were a record of attention, a testament to what it meant to see, to listen, and to participate quietly in the flow of life. Rick traced spirals and flowing lines, capturing the rhythms he had learned, the moments he had witnessed, the lessons quietly absorbed from Maren, his mother, and the world around him. That night, lying beneath the ceiling of his room, Rick felt the weight of all he had gathered. It was not heavy in a burdensome way. It was full, soft and warm, a presence that cradled him gently. He understood that the journey was never about arrival, but about noticing, experiencing, and embracing the quiet unfolding of each day. And as sleep drew him into its calm embrace, he imagined himself moving through the threads he had traced. Rivers, winds, quiet streets, and whispered moments, connected to every small current, every unnoticed gesture, every gentle pulse of life. He exhaled softly, a long, contented breath, knowing that he was a part of something greater, and yet perfectly himself within it. And somewhere he was still out there, listening, noticing, and learning. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man." Winter had fully arrived again, but this time it felt different, quieter, softer, almost as if the world itself had slowed to match the rhythm Rick had come to carry within himself. Snow lay in delicate layers across the streets, muffling footsteps and distant sounds, turning the familiar town into a place suspended between moments. Rick found comfort in this hush, in the soft white blanket that seemed to make every breath he took more deliberate, more present. He wandered through the town slowly, each step leaving a temporary mark on the way out snow, knowing it would soon vanish under the quiet persistence of falling flakes. There was a rhythm to walking in winter that he had never noticed before, the weight of the foot, the subtle shift of balance, the pause between one step and the next. These were not ordinary observations, but whispers of life, subtle lessons in awareness. Maren had grown frailer, yet her visits continued, brief but luminous in their intensity. One evening she guided Rick to the edge of the frozen river. The ice shimmered faintly under the moonlight, reflecting his own quiet reflection back to him. "Even when it seems solid," she said softly, "things shift beneath the surface. What we see is only part of the story. Listen to what is hidden, Rick. It will teach you more than what is obvious." Rick crouched beside the river, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He placed his fingers on the ice and felt a subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, traveling through the frozen surface. It reminded him of everything he had learned, that life was a series of currents, often unseen, and that patience and attention revealed what hurried eyes could never perceive. At home, his mother hummed her lullaby as she worked by the fire. The melodies seemed to stretch longer in the quiet of winter, each note carrying warmth and familiarity. Rick hummed along, his voice soft, blending with hers. He understood now that these harmonies were more than music. They were a shared presence, a living record of connection, care, and continuity across time. School carried on in the usual fashion, though Rick no longer sought the approval or attention of others. Instead, he observed, learned, and quietly acted where he could. A gentle word, a careful gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of another's struggle. These acts, though small, left ripples that Rick could sense in the stillness around him. He had come to understand that influence need not be loud. It could exist quietly, persistently, beneath the surface. One night, walking under the pale light of the moon, Rick paused to watch the snow settle across the rooftops. The world felt infinite and intimate at once, each detail a note in a quiet symphony. He whispered softly to himself, "I see you," as he often did, and felt the familiar echo of connection. A reassurance that his presence, his attention, and his care were threads in a larger tapestry of life. Returning to his room, Rick opened his notebook and began to draw. Lines curved like rivers, spirals mirrored the swirl of snowflakes, and loops captured the delicate rhythm of breath and movement he had observed. Each page carried the weight of his awareness, the quiet power of noticing, and the soft imprint of a life lived in tune with what often went unseen. As sleep finally drew him down, Rick allowed himself to rest fully in the hush of winter. He imagined the threads of life stretching outward, to Maren, to his mother, to the world itself, each one carrying subtle warmth, quiet understanding, and gentle presence. In the stillness of night, he felt a calm certainty that being awake to life in every small, unnoticed moment was a profound form of belonging. And somewhere, beneath the soft glow of moon and snow, he was still out there, listening, learning, and gently participating in the quiet currents of the world. The first hints of spring began to stir beneath the blanket of winter, though the world was still quiet, almost holding its breath. Rick noticed the small signs first, a patch of green pushing through the frozen earth, the distant chirp of a bird braving the cold, the faint smell of damp soil carried on the wind. Life, persistent and patient, was making its return, and Rick felt a soft kinship with it. He walked through the town slowly, boots crunching in the remaining frost, eyes tracing the subtle shifts in light and shadow. The world seemed to move at a different pace now, one that required observation rather than hurry, reflection rather than action. He had grown used to this rhythm, this meditative pace that allowed him to notice currents others overlooked. It was a quiet magic, one that held more depth than any spectacle he had ever witnessed. Maren met him by the garden one afternoon, her steps careful, her presence luminous in its simplicity. "Do you see how the snow has loosened its hold?" she said softly. "Everything has a time to rest and a time to awaken, even us." Rick nodded. He felt the truth of her words in his chest, the gentle pull of patience and persistence, the quiet teaching that life unfolded on its own terms, not his. He spent hours in the fields beyond the town, watching the first shoots of grass push through the frost. Rick traced patterns in the soil, noticing the subtle swell of new life beneath the hardened surface. It reminded him of all the small, unseen changes that shaped the world, the quiet work that often went unnoticed, yet carried the weight of growth. He understood then that his own journey mirrored this rhythm, careful, patient, persistent, and unseen by many, but meaningful nonetheless. At home, his mother hummed the familiar lullaby, but this time it felt different, brighter, tinged with the promise of new beginnings. Rick joined softly, blending his voice with hers, feeling the melody wrap around them both like a gentle embrace. It was in these moments that he felt the strongest sense of continuity, of being connected to generations of quiet attention, care, and understanding. School had shifted with the seasons as well. Friends returned from winter absence, their voices filled with warmth and energy. Rick no longer sought to blend into the background, but he did not seek the spotlight either. He simply moved through the days with quiet awareness, offering support, patience, and presence where it was needed. A gentle word here, a kind glance there. Small acts that rippled outward in ways only he could feel. One evening, Rick wandered to the river, now free of ice, its water reflecting the pale light of the early spring sky. He knelt by the bank and let his fingers drift through the flowing currents, tracing the invisible paths beneath the surface. He whispered softly, "I see you." And for a moment, it felt as though the river itself responded, acknowledging his presence, sharing the quiet understanding that had been cultivated over months of careful attention. Returning home, Rick opened his notebook and began to draw, capturing the subtle rhythms of life around him. Spirals of water, loops of wind, and lines of light stretched across the pages, recording not just observation, but understanding. Each mark carried patience, awareness, and a deep recognition that every small gesture, every quiet moment, was part of the greater whole. As he lay in bed that night, Rick felt the soft thrill of life awakening around him. The gentle push of spring, the warmth of presence, the quiet flow of connection. He realized once more that the journey was not about arrival, achievement, or spectacle. It was about noticing, participating quietly, and finding one's place within the invisible threads that connected all things. And somewhere he was still out there, moving with the currents, listening, learning, and holding space for the quiet growth of the world. Spring deepened into a gentle warmth, softening the town's edges and coaxing life into every corner. Rick noticed the small miracles, petals trembling on their stems, sunlight pooling in puddles, the steady hum of bees traveling from bloom to bloom. The world felt alive with quiet motion, persistent and patient, and Rick moved among it like a careful witness, attentive to each subtle pulse. He wandered through familiar streets, boots brushing wet leaves, noticing the slight bend of a fence under a creeping vine, the way shadows stretched lazily across cobblestones. These were small things, easily overlooked by others, but to Rick, they were the markers of a deeper rhythm, one that had begun to pulse inside him as well. Life was not loud, it was subtle, nuanced, and endlessly patient. Marin's visits grew shorter, but they remained filled with insight. One afternoon, she guided Rick to a quiet grove, where the sunlight filtered through new leaves and painted the ground with soft, shifting patterns. "Do you see," she said, "how each leaf dances in its own rhythm? And yet together they create a quiet harmony. That's how we must live, aware of ourselves, and yet part of something larger." Rick knelt and ran his fingers through the soft earth, noticing tiny shoots breaking free from the soil. He understood what she meant. Life moved not in grand leaps, but in subtle gestures, quiet persistence, and patient growth. It was in the spaces between action, the moments others ignored, that the world's true magic unfolded. At home, his mother hummed her lullaby, which now felt like a companion to every passing season. Rick joined softly, weaving his voice into hers, feeling the melody echo not only in the room, but in his chest. It was in these harmonies that he felt the strongest connection. To his mother, to Marin, to the generations of quiet observers who had come before him, and to the world itself. School had resumed its familiar rhythm. Friends returned, their voices lighter with the promise of sun and growth. Rick moved among them differently now. He offered small acts of attentiveness. A shared pencil, a patient nod, a comforting glance. Gestures almost invisible, yet carrying profound weight. He had begun to see that these small currents of care were often stronger than any shouted action, rippling quietly through the lives of those around him. One evening, Rick walked to the river, now flowing freely with the thawed snow. The water shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting the muted colors of the fading day. He traced its surface with his fingers, feeling the subtle currents beneath. Whispering softly, "I see you." He listened for the quiet response, a vibration, a sense of presence that was felt more than heard. The river seemed to hold him in its embrace, teaching patience, humility, and the gentle art of noticing. Returning to his room, Rick opened his notebook and drew spirals, loops, and flowing lines that captured the rhythms of the world he had observed. The pages had become more than paper. They were a living record of attention, presence, and quiet understanding. Each mark was a testament to his growing awareness of the subtle currents that connected all things and the gentle joy of participating in them. As sleep drew him down that night, Rick felt the rhythm of life surrounding him, the small miracles, the quiet lessons, the unseen connections. He understood that his journey was not about spectacle or achievement, but about presence, patience, and the subtle act of noticing. He exhaled, soft and full, feeling himself a part of the world's gentle, persistent flow. And somewhere he was still out there, listening, learning, and moving quietly with the invisible threads of life. The warmth of spring deepened, and the town seemed to hum with a quiet vitality that Rick could feel beneath his skin. The streets glowed softly in the afternoon sun, the leaves swayed lazily in the breeze, and the scent of damp earth and flowers lingered in the air. Rick moved through it all slowly, deliberately, aware of every subtle shift in light, sound, and motion. It was a rhythm he had learned to follow, quiet, patient, persistent. He spent long hours wandering the fields and woods at the edge of town, watching life unfold in ways that went unnoticed by most. A spider wove a delicate web between branches, dew clinging to each strand like tiny stars. A bird perched silently, preening its feathers, every movement precise yet unhurried. Rick traced these patterns with his eyes, imagining the invisible threads that connected everything, and felt a profound calm in simply witnessing. Maren accompanied him less often now, her steps slower, but her words retained the same clarity. One afternoon, she gestured to a patch of newly sprouted flowers. "Do you see how each pushes its way into the world?" she said softly. "No one notices the effort, yet it is relentless. That's how life teaches us to endure, to persist quietly." Rick nodded, feeling the lessons settle like a soft weight in his chest. At home, his mother continued her evening ritual of humming the familiar lullaby. Rick joined her softly, letting his voice merge with hers, creating a fragile harmony that seemed to stretch time itself. In these moments, he felt the depth of connection, the quiet strength of presence, and the subtle continuity of care that spanned generations. It was in these small, sustained acts that he discovered the hidden power of love. School moved forward in gentle rhythm. Rick's presence had shifted. He no longer sought to fade or blend in entirely, yet he remained unobtrusive. He offered quiet gestures, a supportive word, a patient nod, a hand extended without expectation, that carried unseen weight. He had begun to understand that influence often worked in silence, the ripples stretching far beyond what anyone could perceive. One evening, Rick walked to the riverbank, the water glinting with the reflection of a sky fading to soft violet. He knelt beside it, letting his fingers skim the current. Whispering, as he often did, "I see you." He felt the same quiet acknowledgement he had grown to recognize over months of observation. The river, steady and persistent, seemed to mirror the rhythm he had cultivated within himself. A soft, unbroken flow of awareness and presence. Returning to his room, Rick opened his notebook and began to draw. Spirals and arcs echoed the movement of the river, loops captured the sway of trees, and flowing lines traced the subtle interplay of wind and sunlight. The notebook was more than a record. It was a testament to patience, attention, and the quiet ways in which life unfolded. Each stroke was an affirmation, a gentle acknowledgement of existence and connection. As sleep claimed him that night, Rick felt the resonance of all he had observed. The whisper of leaves, the shimmer of water, the delicate balance of life around him. He understood, once again, that the journey was not in grand events or loud moments, but in noticing, participating, and moving with the subtle currents that shaped the world. And somewhere he was still out there, listening, learning, and weaving his quiet presence into the fabric of life. The early mornings had grown longer, and the town welcomed them in silence, as if the world itself were savoring each new ray of light. Rick walked along familiar streets, feeling the coolness of the dawn and the soft brush of wind against his cheeks. Every step was deliberate, each breath measured, and every sound, a bird's call, the distant hum of a carriage, the rustle of leaves, carried a gentle significance he had come to cherish. He wandered to the river again, drawn by its quiet constancy. The water reflected the pale colors of morning, shimmering softly, as if it too were waking slowly. Rick knelt at the bank, letting his fingers trail through the cool current, and felt a subtle vibration, the pulse of the world beneath the surface. Whispering softly, "I see you," he let the acknowledgement fill the space between him and the river, a quiet conversation that required no words. Maren joined him that day, her presence luminous yet fragile. She gestured to the horizon where the sun lifted its first rays over distant hills. "Notice how the light changes," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "No two mornings are the same, yet each carries the same promise. Life unfolds the same way, differently each time, yet persistently, patiently. Rick nodded, feeling her words sink into the folds of his consciousness. There was a lesson in subtlety, in quiet endurance, and in the persistence of noticing. At home, his mother continued her ritual of humming the lullaby in the mornings as well as evenings, her voice a tether to continuity and care. Rick joined softly, their notes intertwining, creating a harmony that seemed to expand and contract with the rhythm of the day. These harmonies were not merely melodies, they were markers of presence, attention, and the gentle shaping of the world through love and care. School continued its slow march through the seasons. Rick had learned to navigate it with gentle attentiveness, offering small gestures of care and patience where they were needed most. A comforting word, a shared smile, a hand extended without expectation. These acts had begun to create ripples in the lives around him, subtle yet meaningful. He understood now that the quiet influence of presence often outweighed any loud display of action. One evening, he walked to the outskirts of town where the fields opened wide beneath the evening sky. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of wildflowers and earth. Rick paused to notice the delicate sway of tall grasses, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant movement of a bird across the fading horizon. Every detail, however small, was a story, a moment of life moving quietly, persistently. He felt part of it, not as a controller, but as a participant, a witness, a gentle presence within the flow. Returning home, Rick opened his notebook. He drew spirals that mirrored the flow of the river, loops that reflected the curve of the horizon, and arcs that captured the sway of the trees. Each stroke was deliberate, an act of attention, a quiet acknowledgement of life unfolding around him. The pages had become not just a record, but a meditation, a way to honor presence, patience, and the invisible threads connecting everything. As sleep drew him down that night, Rick felt the harmony of the world envelop him, the river, the fields, Maren, his mother, the quiet gestures that rippled unseen, all converged into a gentle, persistent flow. He realized once more that life's meaning was not in spectacle or loud action, but in noticing, participating, and moving softly within the currents of existence. And somewhere he was still out there, walking, listening, learning, and leaving gentle ripples in the quiet tapestry of life. The days had grown warmer, but the mornings still carried a soft chill that clung to the edges of the town. Rick walked through the streets slowly, feeling the gentle pull of the sun against his shoulders and the quiet hum of life around him. Everything seemed smaller, yet somehow more vivid. The curve of a roofline, the sway of a tree branch, the glint of dew on a window pane. He felt a patient rhythm in it all, a subtle pulse that guided his steps and softened his mind. He made his way to the river once more, finding solace in its unhurried flow. The water mirrored the sky, a pale stretch of morning light rippling across its surface. Rick let his fingers drift along the edge, feeling the currents that moved unseen beneath. He whispered softly, "I see you," a gentle acknowledgement of life's quiet persistence, and felt the familiar echo, a sensation rather than a sound, of being recognized in return. Maren accompanied him that afternoon, her cane tapping lightly against the path. She gestured toward the rising sun, filtering through the newly budded trees. "Notice how it touches each branch differently," she said, voice calm and even. "Even in its subtlety, light leaves a mark, and so do we, Rick, quietly, persistently, in ways that may not be obvious." Rick nodded, letting her words fold into his understanding. There was strength in patience, in quiet observation, and in the small, unseen marks one left on the world. At home, his mother hummed her lullaby, the notes soft, yet lingering in the air. Rick joined her, his voice a tentative echo of hers at first, then blending, forming a harmony that stretched across the quiet room. In that shared song, he felt the depth of connection and the quiet constancy of care, the invisible threads that wove them together, and the gentle reassurance that presence mattered more than grand gestures. School continued its usual rhythm, but Rick moved through it differently now. He offered small attentions. A comforting glance, a shared pencil, a patient nod. Gestures that carried weight in ways subtle yet profound. He had learned that influence did not need to be loud or demonstrative. Quiet presence, attentiveness, and care could ripple out, unseen yet deeply felt, shaping lives and moments that would go unnoticed by the world at large. One evening, Rick wandered to the fields beyond town. The tall grasses swayed in the breeze, the sky painted in soft oranges and purples as the sun began its descent. He paused to observe the gentle interplay of light, wind, and motion. The subtle choreography of life unfolding in slow, deliberate patterns. Rick understood that he was part of this quiet dance, not by controlling it, but by noticing, participating, and moving gently within it. Back in his room, he opened his notebook and began to draw. Spirals traced the river's current, loops reflected the sway of the trees, and lines captured the soft arc of sunlight across the earth. Each mark was an act of attention, a meditation, a quiet acknowledgement of the world's persistent rhythm. The notebook had become more than paper. It was a sanctuary for observation, a record of connection, and a testament to the power of presence. As night drew close, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, feeling the soft exhale of the day around him. The river, the fields, Maren, his mother, and the small gestures that had rippled through time, all flowed together in a quiet harmony that embraced him. He knew now that life's meaning was not in spectacle or loud achievement, but in noticing, participating, and weaving oneself gently into the currents of existence. And somewhere, he was still out there, walking slowly, listening deeply, and leaving gentle ripples in the quiet fabric of the world. The air had grown warmer still, carrying the scent of budding flowers and freshly turned soil. Rick walked slowly through the town, noticing the faint shimmer of sunlight on rooftops, the gentle sway of newly sprouted branches, and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was a rhythm he had come to trust, the quiet unfolding of the world, deliberate and patient, revealing itself only to those willing to pause and notice. He wandered toward the river, drawn by its unhurried pulse. The water reflected the pale morning sky, glinting with tiny ripples that shimmered like scattered jewels. Rick knelt at the bank, tracing the currents with his fingers. He whispered softly, "I see you," feeling the familiar, intangible acknowledgement that flowed back through the quiet of the world. Here, in these gentle moments, he felt connected to the rhythm of life itself, and a deep calm settled into his chest. Maren joined him in the late afternoon, her steps careful yet deliberate. She gestured to the trees along the riverbank, their leaves trembling in the wind. "Every movement, however slight, matters," she said softly. "Even those no one notices leave an imprint." That is how life moves, Rick. Quietly, persistently, and endlessly patient. Rick nodded, understanding that the lesson applied not just to the world around him, but to the small, subtle ways he could touch it with care and attention. At home, his mother hummed her familiar lullaby as she tidied the kitchen, the notes stretching gently into the quiet room. Rick joined softly, blending his voice with hers. In these shared harmonies, he felt a profound sense of connection and continuity, an understanding that presence, more than action or words, shaped the lives around him. The song had become a vessel carrying warmth, care, and the gentle lessons of attentive love. School carried its slow, steady rhythm, yet Rick moved through it with a quiet awareness that distinguished him from the rest. He noticed the small hesitations, the subtle gestures, and the unspoken thoughts of those around him. A comforting glance, a shared notebook, a patient word whispered at the right time. These small currents of attention rippled outward, creating impact far beyond what could be immediately observed. He understood that quiet presence was a power just as profound as any bold display. One evening, Rick wandered to the fields beyond town, where the grass stretched long and wild beneath the soft glow of sunset. He watched the way the light touched each blade differently, how shadows stretched and softened, and how the wind carried whispers of life across the land. Each motion, no matter how small, was part of a larger pattern, and he felt himself moving gently within it, not as a force, but as a participant, a witness, and a quiet presence. Returning home, Rick opened his notebook and traced spirals, loops, and flowing lines that captured the subtle dance of light, wind, and life he had observed. Each stroke was a meditation, an act of attention, and a quiet acknowledgement of the intricate rhythm that connected all things. The notebook had become a sanctuary, a record of presence, care, and gentle understanding. As night drew near, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, letting the quiet harmony of the day settle into him. The river, the fields, Maren, his mother, and the soft gestures that had rippled unnoticed, all merged into a single, gentle flow. He felt the quiet certainty that life's meaning resided not in loud gestures or grand achievements, but in noticing, participating, and moving softly with the currents of existence. And somewhere he was still out there, walking slowly, listening deeply, and leaving gentle ripples in the quiet fabric of the world. The days had begun to stretch longer, and the town glowed with a softness that seemed almost unreal. Rick walked slowly through the streets, noticing the subtle warmth of sunlight on brick and stone, the gentle sway of trees in the afternoon breeze, and the faint hum of life moving quietly around him. It was a rhythm he had come to recognize, one that required patience, attention, and the willingness to simply be. He wandered toward the river, drawn as always to its unhurried pulse. The water reflected the sky, now tinged with the pink and orange of the late afternoon sun. Rick knelt at the bank, letting his fingers trail through the gentle current. "I see you," he whispered softly, feeling the familiar resonance of acknowledgement that moved through the world in ways words could not capture. Here, in these quiet moments, he felt a sense of belonging that had grown steadily over time. Maren met him at the grove, her steps measured and deliberate. She pointed to the flowers that had sprung along the edge of the river. "Notice how each one reaches for light," she said softly. "No two flowers grow the same way, yet all move toward the sun. That is life, Rick, unique, persistent, and quietly beautiful." Rick nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle within him. He understood that patience and observation, rather than action alone, revealed the deeper rhythms of existence. At home, his mother hummed the familiar lullaby, her voice stretching across the quiet room. Rick joined softly, blending his tone with hers, and together they formed a gentle harmony that seemed to linger in the air long after the notes faded. These moments of shared presence had become more than ritual. They were a sanctuary, a soft anchor that grounded him in the calm, persistent heartbeat of life. School moved at its usual rhythm, yet Rick's awareness had deepened. He observed the small gestures, the unspoken thoughts, the quiet hesitations of his classmates. A gentle glance, a patient nod, a hand extended without expectation. These acts carried weight beyond immediate recognition. Rick had come to understand that subtlety held a power all its own, shaping the world quietly, persistently, and without fanfare. One evening he wandered to the fields beyond the town. The grass stretched long and wild beneath the fading light of the setting sun, and the air carried the faint fragrance of blossoms and earth. Rick paused to watch the soft sway of the tall grasses, the delicate rustle of leaves, the distant flight of a bird across the sky. Every movement, no matter how small, seemed to tell a story. He felt himself as part of this story, moving gently, witnessing quietly, participating without force. Returning home, Rick opened his notebook. Spirals traced the meandering river, loops captured the sway of the trees, and arcs reflected the gentle shift of sunlight across the land. Each mark was deliberate, an act of attention, a quiet acknowledgement of the world's persistent rhythm. The notebook had become more than a record. It was a meditation, a sanctuary, and a testament to the quiet power of presence. As night fell, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, letting the calm of the day seep into him. The river, the fields, Marin, his mother, and the subtle gestures that had gone unnoticed all merged into a soft, persistent current of life. He understood that meaning resided not in spectacle or action alone, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the flows of existence. And somewhere he was still out there, listening, observing, and leaving quiet ripples in the fabric of the world. The sunlight of early summer warmed the town softly, spreading long, lazy rays across rooftops, streets, and gardens. Rick walked slowly, breathing in the warmth and noticing the subtle shimmer of light on leaves, the gentle sway of flower stems, and the quiet hum of life around him. Everything felt patient, deliberate, and alive in ways that demanded careful attention to be fully seen. He made his way to the river, as he often did, drawn by its unhurried pulse and reflective surface. The water mirrored the sky's pale blues, shifting with the breeze, carrying whispers of life beneath. Rick let his fingers glide along the surface, feeling the gentle currents, and whispered softly, "I see you." The acknowledgement, felt rather than heard, returned to him through the calm of the world. In these moments he felt a profound sense of presence, as if the river itself held a quiet conversation, meant only for those who would pause and listen. Marin walked alongside him that afternoon, slower now, yet steady in her presence. She pointed to a cluster of reeds along the riverbank. "See how they bend without breaking," she said softly. "Strength is often hidden in flexibility. Life flows this way, Rick, quietly, persistently, resilient in its own gentle manner." Rick nodded, absorbing the subtle wisdom. He understood that endurance and observation mattered more than force or loud action, and that patience revealed the deeper rhythms of living. At home, his mother continued her lullaby ritual, humming in the soft golden light that filtered through the windows. Rick joined her, his voice blending with hers in a fragile harmony. These shared songs had grown into more than music. They were expressions of presence, continuity, and the quiet power of care. They reminded him that love and attention often mattered more than any achievement, any loud proclamation, any outward demonstration. School carried its usual rhythm, yet Rick's awareness had deepened further. He noticed the unspoken needs, the fleeting expressions, and the small hesitations of those around him. Gentle glances, subtle encouragements, acts of attention carried ripples beyond immediate perception. Rick had come to see that quiet presence was a force, soft, patient, and enduring, and that such presence could shape lives more profoundly than any bold gesture. One evening, Rick wandered into the open fields beyond the town. The tall grasses swayed in the breeze, the horizon glimmered under the sun's fading light, and the air carried the faint fragrance of blossoms and earth. He paused to observe the interplay of light, shadow, and movement, feeling himself part of the delicate choreography of life. Every small motion, every ripple in the air and earth seemed to tell a story. He was a quiet participant in this unfolding narrative, neither controlling nor demanding, only observing, listening, and moving gently within it. Returning to his room, Rick opened his notebook. Spirals traced the river's currents, loops captured the sway of the reeds, and arcs reflected the gradual shift of sunlight across the land. Each stroke was deliberate, a meditation, and a quiet acknowledgement of the persistent rhythms of life. The notebook had become more than a record. It was a sanctuary, a testament to observation, care, and the gentle power of presence. As night settled, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, allowing the calm of the day to fill him completely. The river, the fields, Maren, his mother, and the subtle gestures that had rippled quietly all merged into a soft, persistent current of existence. He realized that life's meaning resided not in spectacle or loud action, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the currents that carried the world forward. And somewhere he was still out there, walking softly, listening carefully, and leaving quiet ripples in the fabric of the world. Summer had reached its full warmth, and the town seemed to sigh beneath the sun, as if exhaling the slow, golden light into every corner. Rick walked through familiar streets, feeling the soft heat against his skin, hearing the quiet rustle of leaves, the distant hum of bees, the gentle stirrings of life everywhere. Each moment seemed to stretch, lingering in the space between breaths, and he allowed himself to move with it, slowly, patiently, deliberately. He wandered toward the river, drawn once again to its calm, reflective pulse. The water shimmered under the sunlight, carrying the subtle rhythms of the world along its surface. Rick knelt beside it, trailing his fingers in the current, and whispered softly, "I see you." The acknowledgement returned quietly like a gentle echo, resonating not through sound but through presence itself. It was in this constant, patient recognition that Rick had learned the deepest truths of living, to notice, to care, and to flow with life's subtle currents. Maren met him at the riverbank for one last visit, her frame more fragile now, her steps measured. She pointed to the gentle movement of the reeds, the shimmer of sunlight on water. "Life," she said softly, "is made of these small currents. They may seem insignificant, but together they create the whole. Remember that, Rick. Always be present. Always notice." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into him, a quiet understanding that would linger long after she was gone. At home, his mother hummed the familiar lullaby one last time in the evening light, her voice a soft thread weaving through the air. Rick joined, his voice blending with hers in gentle harmony. In the music, he felt the echo of countless small gestures, countless quiet presences, each one a note in the larger song of life. He understood that love, attention, and patience were the true forms of strength, quiet, persistent, and enduring. School had long since passed into routine, yet Rick moved through life differently now. He saw the unspoken, felt the subtle, and offered gentle attentions without expectation. A shared smile, a patient glance, a word spoken softly. These ripples extended beyond the eye, beyond the moment, leaving traces of presence and care that endured quietly. he realized that the world was not shaped by loud acts alone, but by steady, persistent, unnoticed currents flowing gently beneath everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Rick walked into the fields beyond town for the last time in this chapter of his life. The tall grasses swayed, the light softened, and the air carried the fragrance of earth, flowers, and sun-warmed soil. He paused, breathing deeply, and allowed himself to notice the gentle sway of each blade, the shimmer of a butterfly's wings, the way the sky reflected in the distance. Everything moved in quiet harmony, and he felt at once both small and infinite, a single note in the endless symphony of life. Returning home, Rick opened his notebook, tracing the familiar spirals, loops, and arcs that captured the rhythm of the world around him. Each line was a meditation, a testament to the act of noticing, and a quiet acknowledgement of life's persistent pulse. The notebook had become more than paper. It was a sanctuary, a living record of presence, care, and connection, a reminder that the smallest attention could echo far beyond itself. As night drew near, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room. The river, the fields, Maren, his mother, and the subtle currents of everyday life merged into a soft, persistent flow. He breathed slowly, exhaling the weight of all he had observed and learned. He understood that life's meaning was not in spectacle or loud action, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the rhythms that carried the world. And somewhere he stretched into the stars, listening, learning, and leaving quiet ripples in the fabric of existence. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The warmth of late summer had settled over the town like a slow, golden sigh. Rick walked through the streets, noticing the familiar shimmer of sunlight on the rooftops, the gentle sway of tree branches, and the quiet movement of life unfolding around him. Everything seemed deliberate, patient, and alive, yet nothing demanded attention. It simply existed, inviting him to notice and breathe with it. He wandered toward the river, drawn again to its unhurried flow. The water mirrored the sky's soft hues, shifting with the breeze, carrying whispers of life beneath its surface. Rick knelt at the bank, letting his fingers glide through the cool currents. He whispered softly, "I see you," and felt the familiar, wordless acknowledgement return through the quiet of the world. There was a rhythm here, subtle yet persistent, a gentle pulse that had become part of his own heartbeat. Maren joined him for a quiet walk along the riverbank, her cane tapping lightly against the soft earth. She gestured toward the distant horizon, where light stretched thin and golden over the fields. "Life flows," she said softly, "and we are invited to move with it, not to force it, not to control it, but to notice and participate." Rick nodded, absorbing her words. He understood that presence and patience often mattered more than action or intent, and that the smallest gestures could ripple endlessly if offered with awareness. At home, his mother hummed her familiar lullaby as the afternoon light streamed through the window. Rick joined softly, blending his voice with hers. The melody seemed to hang in the air, long and fragile, carrying the quiet wisdom of continuity and care. He felt warmth in the resonance of their shared song, a gentle thread connecting past and present, carrying soft lessons of love, attention, and patient observation. School moved at its usual unhurried pace, yet Rick had learned to observe its subtleties. He noticed fleeting glances, tiny hesitations, and small gestures that passed unnoticed by most. A shared notebook, a quiet word, a patient nod. These simple acts carried weight far beyond what anyone could see. Rick had come to understand that influence often worked silently, spreading slowly through gentle currents rather than bold displays. One evening, he wandered to the open fields beyond the town. The tall grasses rippled in the soft wind, the sky glimmered with the fading light, and the air smelled faintly of earth and blossoms. Rick paused to observe the slow dance of life, the sway of the grasses, the shimmer of a dragonfly's wings, the soft hum of distant insects. Everything seemed to communicate in its own quiet way, and Rick felt himself woven into this subtle, persistent rhythm. Back in his room, Rick opened his notebook and drew spirals and arcs that mirrored the flow of the river, the sway of the grass, and the patterns of sunlight. Each stroke was deliberate, a meditation, and a quiet acknowledgement of the world's invisible currents. The notebook had become a sanctuary, a living record of attention, care, and gentle understanding, reminding him that noticing, truly noticing, was a form of presence and love. As night drew close, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, letting the calm of the day fill him completely. The river, the fields, Marin, his mother, and the quiet gestures of life merged into a gentle, unbroken current. He realized once more that meaning resided not in spectacle, loud acts, or achievement, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the rhythm of existence. And somewhere he was still out there, listening, learning, and leaving subtle ripples in the soft fabric of the world. The air had shifted into the soft hush of early autumn. Leaves carried faint hints of amber and gold, drifting lazily in the breeze as if reluctant to leave their branches. Rick walked through the town slowly, taking in the quiet transformations around him. Every roof, every window, every corner of the streets held a subtle change. Nothing dramatic, but everything meaningful in its small, persistent way. He made his way to the river, drawn to the familiar comfort of its unhurried flow. The water mirrored the pale sky, and small ripples caught the light, glimmering like scattered fragile stars. Rick knelt at the edge, trailing his fingers through the gentle current, and whispered softly, "I see you." It was not a declaration, but an acknowledgement, a quiet dialogue that required only presence to be understood. In these moments, he felt a deep connection to the flow of life, steady and persistent, both around him and within him. Marin joined him in the late afternoon, her steps careful, measured, yet assured. She gestured toward the reeds swaying at the river's edge. "Change comes slowly," she said softly. "The world moves in quiet increments. Observe it, Rick. Participate without rushing. That is how life endures." Rick nodded, absorbing her words. He understood that patience, attentiveness, and gentle participation often mattered more than action or haste. The subtle currents of care, of presence, were the true forces shaping the world. At home, his mother hummed her familiar lullaby as light from the fading day filtered through the windows. Rick joined softly, weaving his voice with hers in a gentle harmony. It was more than music. It was a testament to continuity, a quiet thread of love and attention that stretched across time. In these harmonies, he felt the invisible connection between past, present, and future, a reminder that presence, however small, mattered profoundly. School had shifted into its autumn rhythm, carrying students and teachers alike through the unhurried flow of learning. Rick moved differently within it, noticing the subtle gestures, fleeting hesitations, and tiny exchanges that others overlooked. A comforting glance, a quiet word, an unnoticed act of patience. These small currents rippled outward, shaping the lives around him without fanfare. He understood that influence often worked silently, invisibly, and that such presence could carry more weight than any grand gesture. One evening, Rick wandered into the fields beyond the town. The tall grasses swayed gently, catching the amber light of sunset. The horizon glimmered in muted colors, and the air smelled faintly of earth, fallen leaves, and distant blooms. He paused, taking in the slow dance of life, the bending of grasses, the flicker of a bird's wing, the subtle hum of the wind. Every movement held its own story, and he felt himself a quiet participant in this unfolding pattern. Back in his room, Rick opened his notebook and drew the flowing spirals and arcs that mirrored the world outside. Each line was deliberate, a meditation, a quiet acknowledgement of the persistent rhythms that connected all things. The notebook had become more than paper. It was a sanctuary, a record of attention, care, and the gentle, sustaining power of presence. As night fell, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, letting the calm of the day settle fully into him. The river, the fields, Marin, his mother, and the subtle currents of life merged into a soft, unbroken flow. He understood once again that the meaning of life was not found in spectacle or loud action, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the rhythms of the world. And somewhere he was still out there, walking slowly, listening carefully, and leaving quiet ripples in the soft fabric of existence. The nights had grown cooler, and a soft mist curled along the edges of the town, blurring rooftops and trees into gentle, muted shapes. Rick walked slowly through the streets, feeling the dampness in the air, noticing how each leaf caught a bead of moisture, how the cobblestones gleamed under the soft haze. Everything moved quietly, without urgency, inviting him to linger, to observe, to breathe with it. He wandered toward the river, drawn to its unhurried flow as always. The water reflected the grey gold of early evening, rippling in patterns only noticeable if one watched patiently. Rick knelt at the edge, letting his fingers drift through the cool current, and whispered softly, "I see you." The acknowledgement returned, subtle and wordless, weaving through the quiet of the world. In these moments he felt the persistent pulse of life itself, steady, gentle, and endlessly patient. Marin joined him for a slow walk along the riverbank, her steps measured and deliberate. She gestured to the reeds that swayed in the wind. "Even in change," she said softly, "life remains resilient. Observe, participate, and allow it to flow through you. That is the quiet strength of existence." Rick nodded, feeling the lesson settle into him. He understood that patience, attentiveness, and gentle presence often held more power than any loud act, and that subtle, unseen currents could shape the world in profound ways. At home, his mother hummed her lullaby as evening light filtered through the windows. Rick joined, his voice merging with hers in a fragile harmony that lingered long after the notes faded. In these shared moments, he felt a profound sense of continuity and care, a quiet thread connecting past and present. Love and attention, he realized, were often most powerful when expressed softly, persistently, and without expectation. School carried its steady rhythm, yet Rick had grown attuned to subtleties others overlooked. He noticed the fleeting hesitations, the quiet gestures, and the soft glances that passed between classmates. A comforting word, a shared notebook, a patient presence. These small acts created ripples far beyond immediate recognition. Rick had learned that influence did not need to shout. It could move silently, persistently, and meaningfully through gentle presence. One evening, Rick wandered into the open fields beyond town. The tall grasses swayed in the wind, the sky reflected muted shades of evening, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and flowers. He paused to observe the slow dance of life, the gentle sway of grass, the glint of wings, the quiet movement of insects. Each subtle motion seemed like a note in a larger, soft symphony, and he felt himself woven gently into this enduring pattern. Returning to his room, Rick opened his notebook. Spirals, arcs, and flowing lines mirrored the rhythm of the river, the sway of the fields, and the subtle shifts of light. Each mark was deliberate, a meditation, a quiet acknowledgement of the persistent rhythms of existence. The notebook had become a sanctuary, a living testament to attention, care, and the soft strength of presence. As night settled, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, letting the calm of the day fill him. The river, the fields, Maren, his mother, and the gentle currents of life merged into a soft, unbroken flow. He understood once more that life's meaning was not found in spectacle, achievement, or loud action, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the rhythm of the world. And somewhere he was still out there, walking slowly, listening carefully, and leaving quiet ripples in the gentle fabric of existence. The early evenings of late autumn carried a crispness that hinted at change, yet the town moved slowly, wrapped in a soft golden haze. Rick walked the streets with deliberate steps, feeling the chill brush against his skin, noticing the way the sunlight caught the edges of fading leaves and the soft, curling mist that clung to the ground. Everything seemed to exist in quiet harmony, inviting observation rather than action, presence rather than urgency. He made his way to the river, drawn to its unhurried, gentle pulse. The water reflected the pale evening sky, moving with quiet ripples that only revealed themselves to patient eyes. Rick knelt at the bank, letting his fingers drift through the cool current, and whispered softly, "I see you." The acknowledgement returned, subtle and wordless, weaving through the calm of the world. In these moments he felt the deep, persistent pulse of life itself, a rhythm steady, enduring, and infinitely patient. Maren joined him, her steps careful, her presence steady and reassuring. She gestured toward the reeds that bent gently in the breeze. "Even as seasons change," she said softly, "the world persists and so do we. Notice the flow, Rick. Move with it. That is the quiet power of living." Rick nodded, letting the weight of her words sink in. He understood that patience, attentiveness, and gentle participation often mattered more than any bold act, and that subtle, unseen currents shaped life more profoundly than noise or haste. At home, his mother hummed the familiar lullaby as shadows lengthened across the room. Rick joined softly, blending his voice with hers in gentle harmony. These moments were more than music. They were a quiet testament to continuity, care, and the enduring thread of love. He realized that the most powerful gestures were often the softest, persistent, and given without expectation. School moved along its unhurried rhythm, yet Rick's awareness had deepened. He observed the fleeting glances, the soft hesitations, and the tiny gestures that often went unnoticed. A comforting word, a patient smile, a gentle act. These ripples extended beyond immediate sight, shaping lives subtly, persistently, quietly. Rick had learned that influence did not need to shout. It could move silently, leaving impressions that endured far longer than any overt display. One evening, Rick wandered into the fields beyond town. The tall grasses swayed in the autumn breeze, the sky stretched in muted shades of amber and grey, and the air smelled faintly of earth, leaves, and distant blooms. He paused to observe the slow, quiet dance of life, the gentle sway of each blade, the flicker of wings, the soft hum of insects moving through the cooling air. Every small movement seemed like a note in a larger, intricate symphony, and he felt himself woven gently into the enduring pattern. Returning home, Rick opened his notebook and traced spirals, arcs, and flowing lines that mirrored the river, the fields, and the subtle shifts of light. Each stroke was deliberate, a meditation and a quiet acknowledgement of the persistent rhythms of existence. The notebook had become a sanctuary, a testament to attention, care, and the soft, sustaining power of presence. As night drew close, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, letting the calm of the day settle fully into him. The river, the fields, Marin, his mother, and the quiet currents of life merged into a soft, unbroken flow. He understood once more that life's meaning was not found in spectacle, loud action, or achievement, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the rhythms of the world. And somewhere he was still out there, walking slowly, listening carefully, and leaving quiet ripples in the gentle fabric of existence. Winter had begun to touch the edges of the town, painting rooftops with frost and sending quiet shivers through the air. Rick walked slowly along familiar streets, feeling the crispness against his skin, noticing how the low sun cast long, soft shadows across cobblestones and leafless trees. Everything seemed hushed, patient, as if the world itself had taken a gentle breath and was exhaling slowly, inviting him to move with it. He made his way to the river, drawn once more to its unhurried flow. The water shimmered with a muted light, reflecting the pale sky and the frost along its banks. Rick knelt beside it, letting his fingers trace the cold currents, and whispered softly, "I see you." The acknowledgement returned, subtle and unspoken, flowing through the quiet of the world. In these moments, he felt the deep, steady pulse of life, a rhythm persistent, gentle, and eternal. Marin joined him for a slow, careful walk along the riverbank. She gestured toward the reeds, now tinged with frost, bending without breaking in the faint winter wind. "Even in stillness," she said softly, "there is movement. Even in endings, there is continuation. Observe, participate, and let the world flow through you." Rick nodded, understanding that patience and gentle presence were far more powerful than noise or haste, and that subtle, unseen currents often carried the greatest impact. At home, his mother hummed the familiar lullaby, its notes drifting across the quiet room. Rick joined softly, blending with her voice in a fragile harmony that seemed to linger even after the last note faded. These shared moments were a sanctuary, a testament to continuity, care, and the invisible threads that connected past, present, and future. He realized that the smallest gestures of attention and love were often the most enduring. School had long since become routine, yet Rick's awareness continued to deepen. He observed fleeting glances, subtle hesitations, and tiny acts of care among classmates. A comforting word, a patient smile, a quiet presence. These small ripples extended far beyond immediate perception, shaping lives in ways unseen but deeply felt. He understood that influence did not need to shout. It could flow quietly, persistently, and meaningfully through simple, thoughtful presence. One evening, Rick wandered into the fields beyond town. Frost clung to the tips of the tall grasses, and the air carried the faint scent of cold earth. The sky stretched in soft greys and pale golds, reflecting in the still water nearby. Rick paused to take it all in. The sway of grass, the glint of wings, the faint hum of life enduring through quiet cold. Every motion, no matter how small, seemed like a note in a vast, gentle symphony, and he felt himself woven into its continuing rhythm. Back in his room, Rick opened his notebook and traced spirals, arcs, and flowing lines that mirrored the river, the fields, and the subtle shifts of light and frost. Each mark was deliberate, a meditation, a quiet acknowledgement of the world's persistent pulse. The notebook had become a sanctuary, a testament to observation, care, and the enduring power of gentle presence. As night fell, Rick lay beneath the ceiling of his room, letting the calm of the day settle fully into him. The river, the fields, Marin, his mother, and the quiet currents of life merged into a soft, unbroken flow. He understood, once more, that life's meaning resided not in spectacle, loud action, or achievement, but in noticing, participating, and moving gently with the rhythms of the world. And somewhere he stretched into the stars, listening, observing, and leaving quiet ripples in the fabric of existence. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.